Why silence rewrites power. Silence changes control because it alters the flow of information, reduces exposure to error, and shifts attention away from performance and toward inference, which increases perceived depth and reduces challenge without overt demand for it. When one person withholds words while others continue, the setting reallocates cognitive effort toward interpreting the quiet figure, and that effort functions as tribute because resources are used on their possible meaning rather than on contesting their position. The observed effect is not mystical or rare. It follows from a basic redistribution of uncertainty, in which the quiet person becomes the fixed point others must approach, align to, or work around, while speaking parties spend their own position to maintain motion, explanation, and reassurance. This is not about virtue or technique. It is about who carries the burden of clarity and who can force others to carry it for them. As soon as silence becomes the norm for one participant, the others fill the gap according to their incentives, attachment to speed, and fear of social discomfort, which ensures that the quiet participant controls pace and frame without explicit assertion. In many environments, the instinct to talk forms early because it secures short-term relief from ambiguity, reduces the personal discomfort of being misread, and creates the superficial appearance of collaboration, even as it encodes dependency on external validation. Over time, this becomes a learned loop. Perceived confusion triggers more detail, raised eyebrows trigger more softening, and any hint of impatience triggers faster delivery, with each addition partially neutralizing an imagined risk, while creating a new record of commitments that constrain future choices. The internal narrative frames this as responsible transparency or conscientious teamwork, because immediate feedback rewards volume and availability, and because institutions praise clarity while quietly discounting those who generate it without limits. In contrast, the pattern of silence forms among individuals who have noticed that most statements can be used against the speaker later, that early specificity is traded at a discount, and that people will volunteer their concessions if the cost of waiting is pushed onto them. None of this appears dramatic in real time. It looks like one person taking their time while another tries to be helpful. They lose status each time they explain. Silence compresses ambiguity into a clear asymmetry. Those who remain quiet preserve optionality, while those who speak commit to positions that can be scored, ranked, and revised by others with less cost. The quiet participant does not need to declare authority. They allow time pressure to work on others until the most impatient party proposes a path, which then becomes the new default, requiring a counterproposal to overturn, shifting initiative away from the quiet figure and toward a visible target they did not present. Because groups dislike dead air and unresolved tasks, members compete to refill the space with summaries, interpretations, and offers, each of which increases the quiet person's leverage by expanding the set of concessions others have pre-committed in public. The psychological mechanism is simple. Silence signals self-sufficiency and lack of dependence on approval, and those signals register as power because they indicate lower social risk, and lower social risk indicates alternative options, allies, or resources not immediately visible. People do not consciously compute this chain, but they behave as if they did, by granting deference to the person who appears least burdened by need. Words behave as commitments in social settings, so the talkative person generates artifacts that can be replayed, compared, and held against them, while the quiet person generates none, and therefore accumulates fewer liabilities. In meetings, the person who speaks first sets an anchor, and anchors can be discounted or undercut, which means the first mover loses bargaining room even if they believe they have seized control, because the frame can be reinterpreted without their consent later. In negotiations, the party that justifies numbers telegraphs constraints, and once constraints are known, concessions can be requested with moral cover, because the requester appears reasonable, and the explicable appears inconsistent if they resist. The same process happens in ordinary conversation, where oversharing supplies a map of sensitivities that others can navigate to extract compliance, attention, or forgiveness, all while preserving their own opacity. From the inside, the talker experiences relief at being understood. From the outside, observers record weak points that will not be defended. Power decreases when they fill every gap. The pattern forms not because people want to be weak, but because people want to resolve discomfort and avoid negative evaluations. And speaking feels like action, while silence feels like exposure, even though the exposure belongs to those who are speaking. Social conditioning ensures that responsiveness is equated with reliability, and reliability with worth, which leads many to confuse availability with value, until their availability becomes background noise, and their value is assessed on different terms set by someone else. Silence avoids this conversion, because it never supplies enough data for others to use to reposition the person as a service, yet it provides enough presence to force others to relate to them as a locus of decision. Over time, groups record who absorbs the cost of clarifying confusion and who does not, and this record quietly becomes a hierarchy, with the quiet figure treated as a source of threshold approval and the talkative figure treated as an executor of whatever the room has already agreed. None of this requires explicit hierarchy or titles. It is a byproduct of cumulative assignments of effort. From the inside, silence feels justified because it is experienced as restraint, as protection against misunderstanding, and as a neutral posture that keeps options open, which are all accurate descriptions of its effect. The person remaining quiet does not need to imagine a strategy to be recognized as central. Their lack of haste reads as independence, and independence reads as strength, which produces compliance from others who prefer to attach to a stable point rather than risk solitary decision. Meanwhile, the person who speaks believes they are preventing mistakes by over-clarifying, proving fairness by disclosing trade-offs, and building trust by making their thinking visible, which are all aligned with institutional rhetoric, but misaligned with how status is allocated under scarcity of attention. Their belief does not reduce the cost they pay. It accelerates it, because each disclosed thought becomes ground others can occupy and redeploy. The sense of fairness that accompanies self-explanation conceals the fact that others are free riding on the risk they take when they put detail on the record. Silent participants inherit the benefit of attribution because observers project competence into blank space more readily than they revise. Judgments against evidence, which biases the setting in favor of the person who provides less textual material to disconfirm a favorable impression. This projection is intensified under time pressure because uncertainty becomes costly, and the presence of a figure who does not panic reduces group anxiety regardless of their actual contribution, which cements their status as a stabilizer. The cognitive load of guessing their stance induces conservative behavior among others, who avoid direct challenge to avoid miscalculation, and instead aim their arguments at the talkative person who has already shown a willingness to take hits. This is why silence can remain politically safe, even if the silent person is underqualified. Their lack of declared positions leaves fewer attack surfaces, and the room reallocates scrutiny to whoever speaks, simply because scrutiny needs material targets, and the silent person has supplied none. The process continues until the difference in reputations becomes self-sustaining. Their credibility declines when they overtalk. From the inside, signals are misread because the quiet figure appears emotionally neutral, even when they are disengaged, and neutrality is often mistaken for depth, while the expressive figure appears vulnerable even when they are competent, and vulnerability is often mistaken for instability. When the expressive person notices flat faces, they assume they have not provided enough context, not that the faces are conserving leverage by withholding reaction, which leads to more detail and a steeper discount applied by the room to every new statement. The talker misreads nods as agreement when nods are merely attempts to move the conversation along, and they misread silence as confusion when silence is a tactic to stretch their willingness to concede. In contrast, the silent person misreads the room less, not because they are wiser, but because they are reading fewer responses, since the room offers them fewer visible challenges to parse, creating a positive feedback loop of calm. The mismatch in perceived feedback produces a stable allocation of risk and reward that feels justified to both parties as it occurs, which ensures repetition. When leaders speak sparsely, subordinates treat their words like decisions rather than opinions, while when peers speak abundantly, their words are treated like drafts to be edited, making one person's speech count more per unit without increasing effort. The quiet person becomes the reference, even if they have not requested it, because others need a locus for coordination and prefer to choose the party least likely to uproot the plan later, which is the one who has committed least. The expressive person becomes the surface where every plan is iterated, because they are available. And availability signals tolerance for revision, which downgrades their statements from commitments to suggestions in the group's internal calculus. Over time, the group stops seeking permission from the expressive person, since permission is already implicitly given by their history of yield, and begins seeking it from the quiet person, who rarely needs to say yes in explicit terms to be treated as the decider. This is how silence writes itself into the center of the system without a visible grab for power. Silence also operates through the allocation of tempo, which matters because time determines whose preferences shape the final form of an outcome, and the party setting tempo chooses the window within which others must fit. By refusing to accelerate, the quiet person reassigns the cost of urgency to others, who routinely pay it by bringing options, contingencies, and concessions to the table unprompted, just to keep progress visible and reputational risk low. This makes the quiet figure the receiver of value, not the provider, which is the core axis along which status actually moves, regardless of public statements about collaboration or openness. The pattern holds in public forums, private negotiations, and internal decisions, because it requires nothing beyond the willingness to let others experience the full weight of their own impatience. Observers do not articulate a conscious change when silence reallocates power. They adjust behavior in small increments that accumulate into a different map of deference, where one person's name is used to end discussions and another person's name is used to continue them. The quiet figure is recorded as someone whose stance defines the boundary of acceptable action, even when that stance is unknown, because teams avoid risking a later veto by the person who can afford to wait. People preface comments with references to the quiet person's likely view, not because they know it, but because invoking it deflects responsibility, which further raises the perceived status of the person who provides nothing to confirm or deny. The expressive figure, meanwhile, becomes a tool for movement rather than a source of decision, which is a dependable but low-leverage position that locks them into execution without equivalent authority. This shift is accepted by the group without debate, because it resolves the practical need for coordination under uncertainty with minimal conflict. People stop trusting their leadership without saying so. As the reframe hardens, leverage moves toward the quiet figure through access control, not through official titles, because the quiet person's limited responses make every interaction feel consequential, which status-seeking observers value. Requests are written differently when aimed at the quiet person, with more preparation and fewer demands, since petitioners want to avoid wasting scarce attention, while the talkative person receives longer, looser requests because their attention is assumed, and assumed attention signals lower rank. In meetings, questions are aimed at the talkative person for details, but eyes return to the quiet person for confirmation of direction, and the direction is accepted even when only implied by lack of objection. In scheduling, the quiet person's limited availability defines the timetable, while the talkative person's calendar is treated as elastic, which codifies whose time counts as a firm resource and whose time can be consumed without cost. These patterns persist until the quiet figure is treated as the last word. Access reduces and calls go unanswered. The expressive person's public archive of statements allows observers to detect inconsistencies, which get labeled as unreliability even when they reflect ordinary adaptation, and that label reduces their bargaining position without any explicit sanction. The quiet person avoids this friction by presenting minimal history, which means any shift in their position is less visible, and therefore less punishable, making them safer to defer to. Stakeholders looking for cover tend to align with the person whose stance is harder to attack, which further isolates the talkative person, because alignment with them carries a higher reputational cost if anything changes later. Vendors, clients, and colleagues gradually route sensitive topics through the quiet figure or through intermediaries who can reach them, leaving the expressive person as an implementation endpoint rather than a strategic node. The new structure is not announced. It is evident in who is copied, who is briefed early, and who is thanked publicly. Budgets and approvals shift without confrontation because those who manage resources prefer to allocate them where they perceive stability, and silence reads as stability, while verbal turbulence reads as volatility, regardless of the actual outcomes produced. The quiet person is offered choices, while the talkative person is offered tasks framed as opportunities, which gives the former more control over scope and timing, and gives the latter more exposure to deadlines and blame. Teams preparing for review produce materials tailored to the quiet person's presumed standards, and they treat the talkative person's standards as negotiable, because history shows they can be argued down, which further erodes their authority. Over time, the talkative person feels constrained by decisions that arrive complete, with their contribution limited to smoothing edges, and their objections logged but ignored during implementation, not out of malice, but because the path was already formed around the quiet figure's tolerance. The result is a subtle hierarchy of who sets terms and who adapts. They get replaced in rooms they built. The reputational economy tightens around these assignments, as others learn to speak about the quiet person in terms of outcomes and about the talkative person in terms of effort. And outcomes are valued over effort when authority is allocated. Mentions of the quiet person's involvement are used to persuade third parties to join or stay, while mentions of the talkative person's involvement are used to reassure that work will get done, which cements the difference each name carries. In conflict, the quiet person is granted the benefit of ambiguity, with their intent assumed to be prudent, even when actions are opaque, while the talkative person's intent is parsed for errors and tone, because there is more material to scrutinize. As this distinction spreads, the talkative person's statements are preemptively discounted and paraphrased by others before they reach decision makers, which reframes them as inputs rather than directives. The quiet person does not need to intervene to maintain this advantage. Passive force is sufficient. Decision pathways evolve until the quiet figure becomes the implied sponsor whose absence can stall projects, while the talkative person becomes the implied contractor whose presence cannot start them, and in that arrangement, formal authority is irrelevant. The talkative person notices fewer invitations to the first meeting, more invitations to the last meeting, and fewer chances to shape the middle, which removes their leverage without a single explicit exclusion. Colleagues who once sought their judgment now seek their labor, and those who once asked for their approval now inform them of outcomes already in motion, with polite language masking the shift. Performance reviews capture this drift unintentionally, praising responsiveness and teamwork, while reserving notes of influence and vision for the person who did not spend time demonstrating either, because the visible behaviors align with the labels already assigned. There is no clear moment when the balance could have gone differently. The evidence always pointed this way. The final stage of reinterpretation occurs when external stakeholders mirror the internal pattern, treating the quiet figure as the de facto center of gravity, while the talkative person becomes their own advocate, which is the lowest credibility position in any status economy. Media, industry peers, or adjacent teams attribute decisions upward toward the quiet figure even when they did not originate there, because attribution seeks simplicity, and silence simplifies causality by removing noise. The talkative person contributes language that other people use, while the quiet person contributes silence that other people defend, and the latter carries more weight because it demands faith rather than proof. When conflicts arise, the quiet figure receives concessions framed as respect, while the talkative person receives concessions framed as favors, which creates different obligations and different future costs. The landscape settles around this distribution. Nothing returns to the prior balance because the network has reweighted itself, embedding the quiet figure at points where attention converges and placing the talkative person at edges where attention disperses. Individual intentions do not change this structure once it is entrenched, because expectations replace analysis, and every interaction confirms the existing map. Requests, approvals, and credit follow the same routes they have followed for months, and deviations are treated as errors to correct rather than options to consider. The movement has already happened, and there is no need for anyone to announce it. The results continue without noise.